The air at the Abernathy farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of freshly cut alfalfa, diesel exhaust, and the ghosts of 50 years of rust. It was the summer of '72, and the whole county, it seemed, had turned out. They weren't just there for the dispersal of a lifetime's accumulation of iron. They were there for the spectacle, to see who was flush, who was faking it, and who was just there to kick tires and gossip over lukewarm coffee from the church lady's concession stand. I was standing near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn denim jeans, a habit I'd picked up to keep from fiddling. My name is Tom Miller. At 28, I was already a veteran of a decade of these sales, ever since Dad first let me tag along. I farmed the 160 acres my grandfather had homesteaded, a piece of ground I knew better than the lines on my own hand. It was good ground mostly, but 40 acres of it, the back 40, was a tangled mess of scrub oak, swamp maple, and glacial rock that had defied every farmer in my family for 3 generations. My operation was modest. A John Deere 4010, the diesel model from '63, was my main horse. Its green paint was faded to the color of a dried-out pea pod, and the left fender had a permanent dent from a disagreement with a gatepost, but that straight-six engine fired up every time, even on the coldest January morning. I had a John Deere 45 combine that was already 10 years old when I bought it, and a collection of plows, discs, and planters that had more welds on them than original steel. Everything I owned was paid for, every nut, every bolt. That was a religion in my family. Debt was a 4-letter word, a sickness you didn't invite into your house. That's why Richard Peterson stood out like a sore thumb in a brand new work glove. He was holding court near the auctioneer's truck, laughing loud enough for everyone to hear. Rich had married into money, taking over his father-in-law's prime 1,000 acres of black bottom land. He farmed with the bank's money, and he made sure everyone knew it. His pickup was a brand new Ford F-250, so clean you could eat off the tailgate. His tractor was a new International Harvester 1066 with the white Deluxe cab, air conditioning, and a radio that was probably playing some rock and roll I'd never heard of. He looked at the rows of old sun-bleached machinery with a smirk, like a king surveying the huts of his peasants. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Hemlock, whose voice could cut through the roar of a straight-piped diesel, was working his way through the smaller items. I picked up a decent set of tire chains for $10 and a grease gun that looked like it had survived a war for another 2. I was about to head home when Bill directed everyone's attention to the centerpiece, parked off by itself like a sleeping giant. It was an Alice Chalmers HD11 crawler tractor, a bulldozer. It wasn't just big, it was immense, a 10-ton mountain of faded orange steel. Its tracks were wider than my chest, each link a masterpiece of cast iron. The blade up front was a solid wall of metal, its cutting edge worn smooth and shiny from years of pushing dirt. A heavy-duty winch was mounted on the back, its thick steel cable spooled tight. It was a machine from another era, the mid-1950s, powered by a legendary Detroit diesel 471 engine. Old man Abernathy had used it to clear fence rows and dig ponds back, when this part of the state was still being tamed. "All right, folks, here's the big one," Bill Hemlock bellowed into his microphone. "An Alice Chalmers HD11. She ain't run in a few years, but Mr. Abernathy said she was running when he parked her. Think of the work you could do. Clearing land, digging foundations, pulling your neighbor's fancy new tractor out of the mud." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Rich Peterson guffawed. "You'd need another dozer just to move that thing to the scrapyard," he yelled, getting the laugh he wanted. I walked closer, ignoring the comments. I ran my hand over the cold, thick steel of the track pads. There was pitting and surface rust, but the grousers still had some bite left in them. I peered at the engine. It was grimy, covered in a thick layer of oily dust, but I could see no obvious cracks in the block. The radiator looked solid. Old man Abernathy was meticulous. If he said it was running when he parked it, he was probably telling the truth. The problem was, parked it could have been 5 years ago. "What'll you give me for this fine piece of American iron?" Hemlock chanted. "Who'll start me at 5,000? 4,000? Come on, folks, the scrap value alone is worth 3. Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the grill of the dozer. No one wanted a machine that big, that old, that complicated. It would drink 50 gallons of diesel in a day of hard work. Parts were getting scarce, and if it had a major problem, you could sink a fortune into it and still have a 10-ton paperweight. $2,000, Hemlock pleaded. Somebody give me $2,000. Rich Peterson was shaking his head, a look of theatrical pity on his face. He caught my eye and mouthed the word junk. Something inside me stirred. It wasn't just about the machine, it was about him, about his easy arrogance, his belief that anything old was worthless and anything new was better simply because it was financed. I looked at that Dozer and I didn't see junk. I saw potential. I saw the key to unlocking my back 40. I saw a way to build something real, something that was mine, without ever setting foot in a banker's office. I had $2,350 in a coffee can buried in the barn. It was my emergency fund, my seed money, my safety net. It was everything. $1,500, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the sudden silence, it carried like a gunshot. Every head turned to look at me. Bill Hemlock's eyes lit up. I got $1,500 from Tom Miller. The young man knows value when he sees it. Now who'll give me 16? Silence. Rich Peterson just laughed and shook his head. 1,500 once, 1,500 twice. Hemlock scanned the crowd, his eyes pleading. Sold for $1,500 to Tom Miller. The hammer fell. The sound echoed off the side of Abernathy's barn. A wave of murmurs washed over the crowd. Some were looks of pity, others of disbelief. I felt a cold knot of fear and exhilaration form in my stomach. I had just bet my entire savings on a 10-ton question mark. Rich Peterson sauntered over, his fancy leather boots kicking up dust. He stopped in front of me, looking from me to the Dozer and back again, a smug grin plastered on his face. "Miller, what in God's name are you going to do with that hunk of junk?" he asked, loud enough for the half-dozen farmers nearby to hear. "Gonna use it for a boat anchor in that swamp you call a back pasture?" I met his gaze. I didn't raise my voice. "I'm gonna clear that swamp, Rich, and when I'm done, I'm gonna grow the best corn in this county on it." He threw his head back and laughed, a loud barking sound. "You'll be broke before you get that thing to fire. The bank would never approve a loan for a stunt like this. But then, you wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Miller? Still playing with your grandpa's toys." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly but felt like a shove. "Good luck," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "You're gonna need it." He walked away, back to his shiny truck, the king returning to his castle. I was left standing there, the owner of a silent, immobile giant with the weight of every doubter in the county settling on my shoulders. Now, before we go any further, before we see if I can breathe life back into that old Detroit diesel, I have to ask you all something. What's the oldest piece of iron you've ever bet your livelihood on? Was it a Farmel H your granddad bought new, or maybe an old Ford truck that just refused to die? Tell me about that one machine you trusted when everyone else said you were crazy. Drop a comment below. I read every single one. Getting the HD-11 home was the first battle in a war I hadn't fully comprehended. A machine of that size and weight couldn't just be towed. I had to call up a heavy hauler from the next town over, a guy with a Kenworth and a lowboy trailer that cost me $200, cash. That was a painful slice out of my operating budget for the year. The driver, a grizzled man named Earl, just shook his head as they used the winch on his truck and a series of chains and snatch blocks to painstakingly drag the dead Dozer onto the trailer bed. "Son," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice, "I hope you know what you're doing." I wasn't sure I did. We unloaded it behind my barn, the steel tracks sinking 6 inches into the soft earth. For a week it just sat there, a monument to my questionable judgment. Every time I walked past it, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors. I could hear the whispers at the co-op, the jokes at the diner. Heard Tom Miller's starting a museum. No, he's just collecting scrap. Got a head start on everyone else. Rich Peterson, I heard, was telling people I'd finally lost my mind, that my stubborn refusal to modernize had curdled my brain. Even my father, a man of few words, was skeptical. He came over one evening, looked at the Dozer, then at me. "That's a lot of machine, son," he said, which was his way of saying, "What were you thinking?" "It's sound, Dad. Just needs some work. Work costs money, time too. Planting season's not far off." He was right. I couldn't afford to let this project distract me from the 120 acres that actually paid the bills. So my days became a grueling routine. Up before dawn, work the fields with the 4010 until dusk. Then, after a quick supper my wife Mary would have waiting, I'd head out to the barn, switch on the single bare light bulb hanging from a rafter, and go to work on the dozer. The first step was to find out why it wouldn't run. The batteries were stone dead, of course. I hauled the two massive 8D batteries out and took them to town to be charged and tested. Both were shot. That was another $100. With new batteries installed, I hit the starter button. Nothing. Not a click, not a groan. The starter motor was frozen solid. I spent 2 nights wrestling that starter off. It was tucked in a space designed by an engineer who clearly hated mechanics, and it must have weighed 80 pounds. I got it on the workbench and took it apart. The inside was a mess of corrosion and dirt. I cleaned every piece, filed the contacts, lubricated the Bendix drive, and put it back together. Another night gone, another reinstallation. This time, when I hit the button, the starter engaged with a loud clunk, and the big Detroit diesel engine gave a single painful-sounding grunt and stopped. It was seized, locked up tighter than a banker's fist. My heart sank. This was the nightmare scenario. A seized engine could mean anything from stuck rings to a spun bearing or a thrown rod, any of which could cost more to fix than I paid for the whole machine. The only way to know for sure was to tear it down. I drained the oil, which came out looking like grey sludge. A bad sign. I pulled the valve cover, more sludge. I spent the next week meticulously disassembling the top end of that Detroit 471. For those who don't know, the Detroit is a 2-stroke diesel, a different beast altogether. No intake valves, just ports in the cylinder liners. A big supercharger, what they call a blower, forces air into the engine. They're noisy, they leak oil from every seal, but when they run, they make incredible power. I pulled the head, a massive chunk of cast iron that took me and a chain hoist to lift. And then I saw it. The number 3 cylinder was full of rust. A leaky head gasket, probably from sitting for years, had allowed rainwater to seep down the exhaust stack and into the cylinder. The piston was fused to the cast iron cylinder liner by a thick orange-brown crust of oxidation. I soaked it in penetrating oil for days. I tried tapping the top of the piston with a block of wood and a sledgehammer. Nothing. It was welded in place. The only solution was to pull the liner, piston and all. That meant dropping the oil pan and disconnecting the connecting rod from the crankshaft. Lying on my back on the cold, oily concrete floor of the barn, with dirt falling in my eyes, I wrestled with the connecting rod bolts. Finally, they broke loose. Now for the hard part. I had to build a puller out of a thick steel plate, some threaded rod, and a 20-ton hydraulic jack. It took me 2 days to fabricate it. I positioned the puller over the cylinder and started pumping the jack. The rods creaked and groaned under the strain. The steel plate started to bend. I was putting thousands of pounds of pressure on that stuck liner. For a long, heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. I thought I was going to break my puller or crack the engine block itself. Then, with a sound like a rifle shot, it broke free. The liner, with the piston still inside, moved a fraction of an inch. I spent the next hour jacking it out, millimeter by millimeter, until the whole assembly slid free from the block. I had won. But the battle had left its mark. My hands were a mess of cuts, bruises and busted knuckles, permanently stained with a mixture of grease and rust. I was exhausted, running on fumes and black coffee. The next challenge was finding parts. No dealer stocked parts for a 30-year-old Dozer. I spent days on the phone calling salvage yards all over the Midwest. Finally, I found a yard in Illinois that had a scrapped-out truck with the same 471 engine. I drove the 6 hours one way in my old Chevy pickup to get a used liner, piston, and connecting rod. The parts were greasy and worn, but they were sound. Back in the barn, the reassembly began. It was slow, painstaking work. I cleaned every surface of the block until it shone. I used a ridge reamer to clean up the tops of the other 3 cylinders. I honed the used liner until the crosshatch was perfect. I checked the crankshaft bearings for wear. I installed the new piston and liner, torqued the connecting rod bolts to spec using a borrowed torque wrench. I lapped the valves on the head and installed it with a new head gasket. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. It was late on a Saturday night in early spring. The fields were ready for planting, and I had lost weeks of precious time. Mary stood in the doorway of the barn, a worried look on her face. I had bled the fuel system, checked the oil and coolant one last time. I climbed up into the operator's seat, the cold steel a shock through my thin work shirt. I took a deep breath. This was it. Failure meant more than just losing $1,500. It meant proving Rich Peterson and everyone else right. I pushed the starter button. The starter motor groaned, turning the big engine over slowly. 1 revolution, 2. It felt like an eternity. A puff of white smoke came out of the short, straight exhaust stack. Then another. The engine caught, sputtered, and died. My heart hammered against my ribs. I waited a moment, then tried again. This time it caught with a cough, then another. The slow, pained cranking turned into a loping, uneven rhythm. Black smoke poured from the stack, filling the barn with a thick, acrid haze. And then it happened. The loping smoothed out, the individual cylinder firings merging into a single deafening roar. The distinctive, high-pitched scream of a 2-stroke Detroit diesel at idle echoed off the tin roof of the barn and rolled out across the dark, sleeping fields. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of defiance. It was the sound of hope. The years that followed that first fire-up were a blur of hard work. But they were good years for farmers. The early 70s brought a wave of prosperity the likes of which no one had seen since the war. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly arranged to buy nearly a quarter of the entire US wheat crop. The deal sent grain prices into the stratosphere. Corn went from $1.50 a bushel to over $3. Soybeans doubled. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling us to get big or get out and to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. It felt like the good times would never end. For men like Rich Peterson, it was a golden age. He became the poster child for the new era of aggressive, debt-fueled agriculture. The soaring commodity prices made his balance sheet look fantastic, and the bank was more than happy to lend him more money against the skyrocketing value of his land. He traded in his 1066 for a brand new John Deere 4630, a monster of a tractor with the revolutionary Sound Guard cab. It was quiet, air-conditioned, and even had an 8-track tape player. While I was still breathing dust and listening to the drone of my old 4010, Rich was farming in climate-controlled comfort, listening to Johnny Cash. He didn't stop there. He bought the 240 acres that bordered his property to the west, paying a price per acre that made old-timers shake their heads in disbelief. To work the new ground, he bought a second big tractor, an Alice Chalmers 7060, and a massive 24-foot field cultivator. His combine was traded for a new Gleaner L2, a silver behemoth that could swallow 8 rows of corn at a time. His farmstead looked like a dealer's lot. Everything was new, everything was big, and everything was financed. In the eyes of the community, and especially in the eyes of the local banker, Mr. Henderson, Rich Peterson was a visionary, a captain of industry. He was winning. Meanwhile, I was waging a slow, grinding war on my back 40 with the HD11. That Dozer, which everyone had laughed at, became my partner. All through the late fall and winter, when other farmers were relaxing or heading south, I was out there in the cold, clearing land. The roar of that Detroit diesel became the soundtrack of my life. I'd start it up in the grey light of dawn, the engine barking to life in the frigid air, and I'd work until I couldn't see anymore. The work was brutal. I'd lower that big steel blade and push, the dozer shuddering and the tracks churning as it tore into the thick brush and small trees. For the big oaks, I'd use the blade to dig around the roots, cutting them one by one, then push against the trunk until the whole tree groaned and toppled over with a crash that shook the ground. The biggest stumps I'd pull with the winch on the back, the steel cable groaning under the strain, the dozer digging its grouses in for traction. It was a constant battle of man and machine against nature. And the machine fought me almost as much as the land did. I broke a track pin and had to spend a weekend with a sledgehammer and a blowtorch driving it out. The hydraulic pump for the blade started leaking, forcing me to learn how to rebuild it on my barn floor. The engine overheated one hot afternoon, and I discovered the radiator was clogged with 30 years of debris. But with every breakdown, I learned. With every repair, the machine became more mine. While Rich was signing loan papers, I was spending my evenings reading service manuals. While he was buying new steel, I was learning how to weld, how to make old steel stronger. The community saw my shabby-looking operation and shook their heads. They saw me covered in grease, wrestling with that old Dozer, and they saw a man falling behind. "Poor Tom," they'd say, "too stubborn for his own good. He's missing the boat." Even Mary, my patient and loving wife, started to worry. "The Petersons just bought a new station wagon, Tom," she said one night, her voice gentle. Jean Peterson showed me the pictures from their vacation to Florida. I knew what she was really asking. Were we ever going to have things like that? Was all this struggle worth it? "We're building something, Mary," I told her, taking her hand. "Something that's ours. No bank can ever take it away." By the spring of '75, I had cleared all 40 acres. I used the Dozer to dig drainage ditches, contouring the land to carry the excess water away. I pushed the rocks into massive piles at the edge of the new field. Then I brought in my old John Deere plow and turned that black virgin soil for the first time. It was rich and dark, untouched by chemicals, full of life. That fall, the corn I grew on that new ground was the tallest and healthiest I had ever seen. The yield was incredible, nearly 30 bushels per acre, more than my old fields. The profits from that one field were modest by Rich Peterson's standards, but to me, they were a fortune. But instead of running out and buying a new pickup, I did something different. I took the money and paid off my annual operating loan from the bank in full. Then I took the rest and bought a handful of US savings bonds and put them in our safe deposit box. I was building a foundation, not a facade. One afternoon late in the season, I was at the bank depositing the last of the checks from the elevator. Mr. Henderson, the bank president, was in the lobby, glad-handing Rich Peterson, who was closing on yet another loan, this time for a state-of-the-art center-pivot irrigation system for one of his new fields. Henderson was beaming, slapping Rich on the back. As Rich left, Henderson noticed me at the teller window. He strolled over, his suit looking out of place next to my dusty work clothes. "Well, hello, Tom," he said, his tone condescending. "Making a little deposit, are we?" "Just cleaning up for the year, Mr. Henderson." He glanced out the window where my 10-year-old Chevy C10 was parked. It had a patch of Bondo on the fender and was perpetually covered in a fine layer of dust. "Still running that old junk, I see," he said with a little chuckle. "You know, Tom, with land values what they are, you're sitting on a gold mine. Your equity is tremendous. You could borrow against it, buy that piece of ground next to you. Really expand. A man can't get ahead by pinching pennies." He was trying to sell me the same dream he'd sold Rich Peterson. The dream of paper wealth, of endless growth built on a tower of debt. I just smiled, a calm, easy smile. "I sleep better at night this way, Mr. Henderson." His own smile tightened. He didn't understand. To him I was a fool, a relic. He shrugged and walked back to his polished mahogany office. As I finished my business and walked out the door, the radio playing softly on the teller's desk caught my ear. An announcer was talking about the Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns and his concerns about runaway inflation. He mentioned the possibility of raising interest rates to cool down the economy. A cold breeze blew down the street, and it had nothing to do with the changing seasons. I felt a sudden, sharp chill, a premonition that the music was about to stop, and I wondered just how many people like Rich Peterson would be left without a chair when it did. The late '70s arrived like a slow, creeping drought. The rain seemed to forget our part of the country. By the summer of '79, the corn in the fields was stunted and pale, the leaves curling up in the afternoon sun as if in prayer for a drop of moisture. The ground in my own fields cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. Ponds shrank, their edges receding to reveal muddy, stinking flats. The whole county held its breath, watching the brassy, cloudless sky. The drought was hard on everyone, but it was harder on those who had to make a big payment every month, rain or shine. Rich Peterson's brand new center pivot irrigation system, the one he'd taken the big loan for, was a marvel of modern engineering. Its long steel arms swept in a perfect circle over his corn, spraying precious water pumped from the deep aquifer. But the cost was staggering. The diesel engine that ran the pump drank fuel day and night, and with the oil embargoes, the price of diesel had nearly tripled. He was saving his crop, but he was burning through cash like it was kindling. Then came the second blow. In January of 1980, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The market, which had been the foundation of everyone's borrowing and planning, collapsed overnight. The price of corn fell through the floor. Suddenly, the bumper crops that men like Rich had been chasing with expensive equipment and chemicals wouldn't even cover the cost of production. The mood at the co-op turned sour. The easy laughter and confident talk of expansion were replaced by hushed, worried conversations. I saw Rich there one morning, arguing with the manager over the price of fertilizer. The easy-going smirk was gone, replaced by a tight, strained look around his eyes. His new Ford pickup had a deep scratch down the passenger side door that hadn't been fixed. It was a small thing, but it was the first sign of neglect, the first crack in the polished veneer. The real trouble for him started that fall during harvest. It was a race against time, trying to get the disappointing crop out of the field before the weather turned. His big Gleaner L2 combine, with all its hydraulic lines and electronic sensors, was a complicated beast. One afternoon, right in the middle of his best field, it just quit. A main hydraulic pump that powered the hydrostatic transmission had failed. It wasn't a simple fix, not like patching a radiator hose on my old John Deere 45. This was a specialized high-pressure pump that had to be ordered from the regional parts depot in Des Moines. The dealer told him it would be 3 days, maybe 4, to get the part, and the repair bill, including the field service call, would be close to $4,000. $4,000. That was more than I'd paid for my combine, my plow, and my disc put together. For 4 crucial days, Rich's Silver Giant sat silent in the field while my old green 45 chugged along, day in and day out. I had spent the winter before rebuilding its simple variable speed belt drive, replacing the worn sheaves and putting in new bearings. It was slow, it was noisy, and it was dusty, but it ran. While Rich paced and fumed and made angry phone calls, I finished my corn, then my beans. I even had time to do 100 acres of custom combining for a neighbor whose own machine had broken down, earning a little extra cash that I put straight into my savings account. When the part for Rich's combine finally arrived, so did the autumn rains. He spent another 2 days waiting for the fields to dry out, losing corn to rot and wind. I saw him at the end of his lane one evening, standing in the mud, just staring at his half-harvested fields as the sun went down. He didn't look like a king anymore, he just looked tired. I kept my head down and my tools clean. My debt-free status, once a subject of quiet ridicule, was now my shield. The HD-11 Dozer, my supposed monument to bad judgment, had become a source of income. With the drought, farmers were desperate to conserve water, and I used the Dozer to dig 2 new ponds for neighbors, clearing the trees and shaping the dams. The work was slow but steady, and the cash I earned went into the coffee can in the barn, not to a banker's pocket. I was still small, still old-fashioned, but for the first time I felt like I was standing on solid rock, while the ground all around me was turning to quicksand. The whispers at the diner started to change. "That old Dozer of Tom's might have been the smartest buy in the county," someone said. "It was a small thing, but it was a start." The turning point wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding realization that the new way of doing things, the easy way, came with a price that was about to come due for everyone. The winter of 1981 was when the real storm hit, and it had nothing to do with the weather. To combat the runaway inflation that had been eating away at the country, the Federal Reserve, under its new chairman Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates. It was like a switch was flipped. The prime lending rate, the number that all our farm operating loans were tied to, went from a manageable 8% to a soul-crushing 21%. 21%. The number was so absurd it felt like a misprint. It meant that for every $1,000 a farmer had borrowed to put his crop in, he owed the bank an extra $210 at the end of the year. It was unsustainable. It was a death sentence for anyone who was heavily leveraged. I went to the bank that spring to renew my small operating loan. the one I used for seed and fuel and paid off every fall. Mr. Henderson sat across his big desk from me, his face grim. He didn't make any jokes about my old truck this time. "Tom," he said, sliding the papers across the desk, "I don't know how else to say this. The rate is 21.5%. I looked at the number. My loan was only for $10,000, but that new rate would add over $2,000 in interest alone. It was a heavy blow." "I understand," I said quietly. I signed the papers. I knew I could handle it. My costs were low, and the custom Dozer work gave me a cushion. As I was leaving, I saw Rich Peterson walking in. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He nodded at me, his eyes hollow. He was headed into the same office, but I knew his conversation with Henderson was going to be very different. Rich's operating loan wasn't $10,000, it was probably over $200,000. The interest on that alone would be more than my entire farm was worth. The farm crisis hit our community like a plague. Green and red and orange machinery, once symbols of pride and prosperity, started showing up on dealer lots, repossessed. Auction notices began appearing in the weekly paper like obituaries. Good families, families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years, were being forced out, their dreams sold off to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. Rich Peterson held on longer than most. He was a fighter. He sold his second tractor, the big Alice Chalmers 7060, for a fraction of what he'd paid for it. He tried to sell the 240 acres he'd bought during the boom, but land values had collapsed. No one was buying. The bank wouldn't renegotiate. They wanted their money. The final notice came in the fall of '82. A full dispersal auction was scheduled for the first Saturday in October. His entire life's work, and his father-in-law's before him, was going on the block. I saw him a few days before the sale at the gas station. He was putting $5 worth of gas in his pickup. He looked thin, his clothes hanging off him. The old arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, beaten-down shame. "Tom," he said, not quite meeting my eye. "Rich," I replied. We stood there in an awkward silence for a moment. "Heard about the sale," I said. "I'm sorry." He just nodded, staring at the ground. "The banker said I was a visionary," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Said I was the future of farming." He kicked at a loose piece of gravel. "Funny thing is, I did everything they told me to do. I expanded, I modernized, I leveraged my assets." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a terrible, bleak understanding. "You were the smart one, Tom. You and your grandpa's toys. You never owed anyone a damn thing." My survival was a quiet affair. While others were panicking, I was working. My 4010 tractor developed a fuel leak in the Rusa Master injection pump. The dealer quoted me $800 for a rebuild. I couldn't afford that, so I bought a service manual and a seal kit for $50. I spent 2 long nights at the workbench in my barn, carefully disassembling the complex pump, replacing the tiny O-rings and seals, and putting it all back together. When I reinstalled it on the tractor, it fired right up and ran perfectly. That repair, that act of self-reliance, saved me $750. It was a small victory, but it was those small victories, stacked one on top of the other, that saw me through. My farm wasn't an empire built on credit. It was a fortress built of old iron and hard-won knowledge, and as the storm raged outside its walls, it was holding strong. The day of the Peterson auction was cold and grey, with a raw wind that felt like winter was coming early. The crowd was different from the one at the Abernathy sale all those years ago. There was no festive atmosphere, no gossip, no laughter. The faces were grim, the conversations hushed. People were there not for sport, but to witness a tragedy, and maybe to pick over the bones. Many of them knew their own auction could be next. The auctioneer started with the small items from the workshop. Rich's tools were top of the line, many of them still shiny in their cases. They sold for pennies on the dollar. I watched Rich standing near the house with his wife, Jean. She was crying silently, her arm linked through his. He just stared straight ahead, his face a mask of stone. He had been proud, even arrogant, but seeing him brought so low, stripped of everything in front of his friends and neighbors, felt wrong. There was no victory in it. Then they moved to the big machinery. The gleaming John Deere 4630, his pride and joy, sold for less than half of what he owed on it. The massive Gleaner combine, the one that had broken down at the worst possible time, went for a price that was an insult. Each fall of the hammer was another blow, another piece of his life being dismantled and hauled away. I hadn't come to buy anything. I came to bear witness, I suppose. Mary was with me, her hand gripping my arm tightly. "This is awful, Tom," she whispered. "Just awful." Finally, the auctioneer moved to the last and most important item, the land. It was being offered in parcels. First, the 240 acres he had bought during the boom. A couple of outside investors got it for a steal. Then the 160-acre parcel to the south. Then another. Finally, all that was left was the original 80-acre homestead, the piece with the house, the barns, and the tree-lined lane his wife had grown up on. "All right, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice tired. "Here it is, the home place. 80 acres, good house, solid barns. Who'll start the bidding?" The silence was deafening. No one wanted to be the one to take a man's home. Mr. Henderson, the banker, stood near the front with a clipboard, looking impatient. If no one bid, the bank would take possession. "Come on, people," the auctioneer pleaded. I looked at Rich and Jean. She had her face buried in his shoulder now, her body shaking with sobs. In that moment, all the years of rivalry, of his smirks and my stubbornness, just melted away. All I saw was a neighbor, a fellow farmer, being broken. I looked at Mary. She saw the look in my eye and just nodded. A single firm nod. I had the savings bonds in the safe deposit box. I had the cash from the custom work in the coffee can. I knew what my top dollar was. It wasn't a fortune, but it was real. It was mine. 50,000, I said. My voice cut through the silence. Every head swiveled towards me. Rich looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Mr. Henderson frowned, confused. Someone else, a speculator from out of town, yelled, 55. 60, I said immediately. 65, the speculator shot back. He smelled a bargain. We went back and forth, the numbers climbing. 70, 75, 80. The crowd was dead silent, watching the two of us. I was bidding against a man with a checkbook, but I was bidding with a decade of saved dollars and scraped knuckles. When the price hit 85,000, I paused. It was almost everything I had. I took a deep breath. 90,000, I said, my voice clear and steady. The speculator hesitated. He looked at me, then at the farm, then back at me. He was just looking at numbers on a ledger. I was looking at a family's home. He shook his head and turned away. 90,000 once, the auctioneer cried. Twice, sold, for $90,000 to Tom Miller. The hammer fell. A quiet gasp went through the crowd. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I had just spent nearly every cent I had in the world. After the auctioneer had packed up and the crowd had drifted away, leaving the farmyard eerily quiet, I walked over to Rich. He was still standing by the house, looking at the ground as if he could will it to swallow him. "Tom," he started, his voice thick, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," I said. "I didn't do this to gloat, Rich." "Then why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "To buy my land for cheap. To finally prove you were right all along." "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "I did it because no man should have to watch his wife cry while strangers carry off her life piece by piece. I did it because we're neighbors." I pulled a piece of paper from my pocket. It was a blank rental agreement from the co-op. "Here's the deal," I said. "You're going to rent this house and these barns from me. The price will be low, just enough to cover the taxes. You're going to farm this 80 acres for me, on shares. We'll split the profit 50-50. You know this ground better than anyone." He stared at the paper, then at me, his eyes filling with tears. The tough, arrogant facade finally crumbled completely. "After everything, after how I treated you." "That's in the past," I said. "The bank beat you, Rich. I'm not going to. Now we've got work to do." That day changed everything. The story of the auction spread through the county like wildfire. The old-timers who had always respected my father's way of doing things now looked at me with a new level of esteem. The younger farmers, the ones who had chased the same dream as Rich, started stopping by my farm, asking for advice. Not about finances, but about fixing things. How to rebuild a carburetor, how to weld a cracked frame, how to keep the old iron running. Rich and I farmed that 80 acres together for the next 5 years. It was a good partnership. He had a deep knowledge of the soil, and I had a knack for keeping the machinery going without spending a fortune. We made it work. Slowly, he got back on his feet. The day he came to me with a check to buy the 80 acres back was one of the proudest of my life. We shook hands, not as rivals, but as friends. Years passed. The farm crisis faded into a painful memory. My own farm grew, but slowly, carefully. I bought 2 neighboring farms when they came up for sale, but only when I could pay cash. My son, David, grew up with grease under his fingernails. He never knew the allure of a brand new tractor. He only knew the satisfaction of bringing an old one back to life. One warm summer evening, when David was about 16, I found him out in the machine shed, staring at the old HD11. I had given it a fresh coat of Alice Chalmers orange paint a few years back, and it sat in the corner like a sleeping lion, a monument to a different time. "Dad," he said, running his hand over the massive steel blade, its edge still polished bright from its war with the rocks and trees. "Tell me again about the Abernathy auction." I smiled and leaned against the track. I didn't talk about interest rates or commodity prices. I told him about the smell of diesel and dust. I told him about the feeling of doubt, of everyone thinking I was a fool. I told him about the roar of that Detroit engine when it first fired up in the barn, a sound of pure defiance. "This machine," I said, patting the solid steel radiator guard, "taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about what something costs, it's about what it's worth. New things cost money, but value you build yourself, with your own 2 hands." He looked from the Dozer to the fields outside, the fields that were all ours, free and clear. He looked at the back 40, now our most fertile ground, and he finally understood. He wasn't just looking at a piece of land, he was looking at a legacy built not on borrowed money or fleeting market highs, but on the enduring strength of old iron, hard work, and the stubborn belief that the best things in life are the ones you build to last.